All right. Well, welcome everyone to tonight's Red Barn event. Thanks for joining us on this nice, warm spring day. We have these Red Barn events to bring different topics to our community here, and I'm excited about the one that we have tonight. My name is Joshua. I'm a community programs educator here at Wenatchee River Institute, and we have Tucker, the other community educator here, back on the tech. So our mission here as a nonprofit is to connect people, communities, and the natural world. And that's what we think about every time we're putting a program together, anytime we're bringing a speaker in here, is how is this going to connect us to nature and to each other. This is your first time coming to a Wenatchee River Institute event? Great, well thank you, welcome coming. Hope you get an opportunity to walk around the campus here. We have a small campus, but it does extend down the hill a little bit to the river. And so we try to take care of this land that we have and use it for educational purposes. So we consist of both youth programs, where we'll bring classes here to our campus to do environmental lessons. We had some earlier today. They're learning about birds a lot this season, as we have birds migrating through. But we also had a bear on campus, and so a lot of the kids got to see their first black bear pretty close. Yeah, they were pretty excited about it. And so we're just trying to connect everyone, including the kids, to those experiences. The other side is community programs, and so that's talks like this that we'll put on. We just had a big event called Spring Bird Fest, where we have a bunch of birding trips, and we bring lots of people here to Leavenworth for that. And then we have various workshops throughout the season. So part of what we try to do here in terms of connecting people is also connecting the indigenous people to this home that they've been connected to for generations. And one way that we do that is by reading a land acknowledgement. And so I'm going to read that land acknowledgement here at the start of this. So this land acknowledgement was created alongside the Shimpisquatchie people, and we're spreading the message they wish to spread to the public. The land Wenatchee River Institute sits on is the ancestral homelands of the Shimpisquatchie, Pisquosa, or Wenatchee people. The Shimpisquatchie, meaning people in between, had villages positioned along the Wenatchee River and surrounding areas. Their ancestral homeland extends from the Cascade Ridge throughout what is now known as the Wenatchee and Okanagan Valleys. The culture and economy of the Shimpisquatchie people centers on taking care of the land. They fish, hunt, gather roots and berries, basket-making materials, and medicines. The Shimpisquatchie are named within the Yakima Treaty of 1855, and language to establish the Wenatchee Reservation was never followed through, even with the needed surveying completed. Many Shimpisquatchie now live on the Colville Reservation, 150 miles northeast of Leavenworth. They were forced off their land here, and the U.S. government moved them to this reservation. The Shimpisquatchie people are still alive today. They continue to practice their culture, harvest their traditional foods and medicines, and hold their ceremonies passed down from their ancestors. Most people won't see or notice them, but they continue to be on the land they are connected to. Their traditional language is in Hamchin, an interior Salish dialect, and I'd like to welcome you all by saying hello in their language, Tilhusht. Tilhusht. We offer this land acknowledgement as the first step to amplifying Indigenous voices and recognizing the harm done to them as a people. And we stand as an ally to recognize their connection to the land and their rights to practice their culture on these sacred lands. And we encourage all to learn about the Indigenous people of the place you call home. The Wenatchee River Institute is committed to sharing this land acknowledgement and following up with other actions to educate and be respectful. All right. So for us to be able to do these Red Barn events, we of course have our sponsors. So I'm going to thank the sponsors we have for this season, and that is Ryan House, Icicle Brewing, South Restaurants, North Central Washington Audubon Society, München House, Sleeping Lady Mountain Resorts, Gustav's, Obertal Inn, Chocolat, Bernhaus, Cove Resort at Fish Lake, Tierra Learning Center, River Rock Gym, Rimmer, Reuter, and Construction. And I have lots others up here on the screen. All right. So for the presentation, we are streaming it for folks that maybe can't make it here. And so for that, I just ask that you save questions to the very end, where we can have that engagement online with people as well. And now, without further ado, I'm going to introduce Tyler Larson. He is part of the Mack Creek Ranch team, and he's going to give us our talk today. So thank you, Tyler. All right, there you go.
Thank you, Joshua.
You're welcome.
Thanks, everyone, for being here, and everyone tuning in at home. My name's Tyler, and today we're going to talk about taking an active role in land stewardship. This talk mostly focuses around forest ecosystems because that's primarily what we work with, but these principles can be applied to any type of ecosystem that you might be living or working with. Before I get too deep into this talk, I want to bring up Martha Wyckoff. She is the landowner who has facilitated all of this work, and I want her to be able to give you a little background on herself and her management philosophy.
Thanks, Tyler. Hello, everyone. I'd like to thank you and the Wenatchee River Institute for inviting us to tell our story about Mack Creek Ranch. But first, I'd like to acknowledge our Mack Creek Ranch team. We've got almost everybody here tonight, and just a chance to our newest employee is Wendy and her husband Jim. John Bean and Stephanie are on the team. And Adam and Caitlin, and Tyler and Adrian, and my husband Jerry. We couldn't do it without this group of people, the kind of work, the stewardship work that we're doing. We feel fortunate that we've got a group of people who are inquisitive and committed and really smart on working at the ranch, and we've made a commitment to use science, experience, experimentation, and lessons learned to enrich the ranch for stewardship. It did start as a hay farm, and we grew wheat along the way. It all started when my husband and I had 3 little children, and we needed a place outside of Seattle to let them run wild, which was very important at the time. And excuse me, I've been losing my voice a little bit. So they've a chance to run wild and have unlimited freedom. And in fact, we have a small world connection that Canucci was a teacher at the school where my sons attended in Seattle at the time. So just another hello. We started with a small hay farm and began to realize that the farm ground around us was getting consumed as subdivisions to a large extent. And that isn't possible to buy everything in a conservation mode. So slowly, my husband and I purchased some of the farm ground around us and carried it on in wheat and hay. We both have been involved with the Trust for Public Land as national board members for many years, so we're familiar with the conservation movement. But no organization can do the amount of land conservation work that's needed to protect some of these habitats and steward the land going forward. So fast forward, during COVID, we settled into the ranch full time and had a chance to step back and think a little differently. While keeping some conventional agriculture, we also considered we had forest ground, prairie land, and seasonal creeks. And what could we do that would give a habitat consideration, a conservation consideration, climate resiliency, and health stewardship from the soil to the treetops for the forest. So we ended up hiring Tyler and Adam, who will really be giving the talk this evening. But we use biology and science and have decided that we will experiment with as many techniques as possible, including prescribed fire. And I see that Sean's here tonight, who's been on a couple of our fires. We had a prairie fire and prescribed fire, and also a forest prescribed fire. So just briefly, it's a commitment to long-term stewardship. It's a commitment to finding resiliency for the forest over a 50-year period is our goal, and to be taking into consideration habitat, the wildlife, the birds, and we're also very concerned with water for fish. So each one of these are parts of the formula for our work. But the real stars of tonight are Tyler Larson and Adam Hess, and they'll carry on from here. Thank you.
So I'll introduce myself, actually, before we get started. My name is Tyler Larson. I am a graduate from Central Washington University through the biology program. During my time there, I mostly worked with and studied reptiles and amphibians. And now I'm a wildlife biologist and forest land manager at Matt Creek Ranch. Here's kind of a roadmap of the talk today. We're going to start with some history of the landscape to give a little context as to what the current conditions are. And then we'll talk about the current state of our forests and the threats that are facing them. And talk about some solutions to some of those issues that we're facing. And then I'm going to go in and talk about Matt Creek Ranch as a case study for land stewardship. So we're located in the Teanaway area. We are actually at the Teanaway River Valley bottom, where the ponderosa pine dry forest meets the swamp prairie. So it's a really unique and beautiful ecosystem to work in. And a lot of this history that I'm going to be talking about is applicable to most of the inland northwest dry forest. And these forests are not actually as old as people think they are. The last glacial maximum toward the end of the last ice age was about 18,000 years ago. And during this time, much of Washington state was covered in ice. As these glaciers began to recede, people, wildlife, and plants all began expanding northward into these newly habitable areas. We have evidence that indigenous people were in the inland northwest at least 13,000 years ago. And that means these people were here before the forests were even here as we know them today. So these forests evolved alongside human presence on the landscape. The indigenous people that were in the Teanaway area were the Upper Yakima people, and they used fire as a land management tool. They used fire to stimulate vegetation growth for game animals, to enhance their food crop production, and to open clearings in the forest for easier travel and hunting, among many other things, obviously. Euro-American westward expansion in the 19th century brought with it landscape-level alterations that fundamentally changed the way these forests looked and functioned. The biggest factor, or the first factor in this, was selective logging, also known as high grading. So many of the largest trees were removed from the forests, and that left behind many smaller trees, and those trees were not as resilient to disturbance. In the late 1800s, there were a series of large wildfires in the Northwest, along with the large fires that are famous in 1910, and that is what ushered in the era of fire suppression all throughout the West. During this time, Native American use of fire on the landscape was outlawed, and all fires were to be controlled, contained, and extinguished as soon as possible. This was made easier by the widespread fragmentation that was happening across the landscape with roads, farm ground, development. These all provided fuel breaks and made it easier to contain and suppress fires. I know this is a bit of a dramatic picture, but last year in Washington, we experienced our second highest number of wildfire ignitions ever recorded. Over 1,800 wildfire ignitions and 165,000 acres burned. This actually isn't that bad considering the 10-year average is almost 500,000 acres burned in the state. These wildfires are exacerbated by invasive species, primarily annual grasses, and they're also exacerbated by climate change. 2023 had the highest global average temperature ever recorded. And climate change, other than the heat, it also causes weather patterns to become more unpredictable and severe, and it can exacerbate drought. In mid-April, the Department of Ecology in Washington declared a drought emergency for the state. So in all of these areas in orange here, it's our fourth earliest drought declaration in the state. And in forest ecosystems, this stunts growth of trees, and all of these factors are compounded when they're combined with stocking levels that look like this. And I'm sure a lot of people in Washington have seen forests that look this way driving around. They're often called dog hair forests. They're characterized by having too many trees that are very small and it's not a productive ecosystem. These trees will never grow to their full potential, and if they're left this way long enough, they won't grow to their full potential even if they're thinned. I don't know if you can see from the picture, but there is no vegetation growing in the understory. Very little biodiversity is supported in these ecosystems, and they don't function as great wildlife habitat either. Bark beetles are a native component to our forests, and they're essential for forest health. But when we have such an imbalance in our ecosystems, they can have severe negative effects. In fact, in 2022, we lost more than twice as much forest in Washington to bark beetles than we did to wildfire. So how can we help with these issues and make the forest a better place? The good news is that half of all private forest land in Washington is owned by small forest landowners. It's over 3 million acres. And as landowners, we can work together and we can actually get things done, sometimes easier than some of the agencies can. And we can do this by being stewards of the land. So stewardship means that you use careful and responsible management of a resource that you're entrusted to. And to be good stewards, we must be active managers. We can't just sit by and let nature run its course anymore, because we have not allowed it to do that. We've taken away its ability to manage the forests with fire suppression and just letting our forests get to this point in the first place. Choosing to not manage your forest is a management decision, and so we have to be active managers, and we have to be active managers with forest health at the top of our priority list. Forest health isn't just the health of a stand of trees, but it's the soil health, it's the amount of biodiversity. Those are what make ecosystems resilient and allows them to bounce back after disturbance. So what does stewardship look like? At Matt Creek Ranch, this is where we've been working for over 3 years, doing everything we can to be good stewards of the land. We have 400 acres of forest, 400 acres of grassland, and about 150 acres of Timothy hay production. Matt Creek Ranch has put forth a lot of effort to try to be good stewards to the land, and we appreciate Wenatchee River Institute for having us here to share our work with everybody, and we hope that we can inspire others to work together and make the forest a healthier, more resilient place. So I'm going to outline some of the larger management activities that we've done at Matt Creek, beginning with thinning. So in the winter of 2020, much of the forest on the property was thinned. We have, on average, about 1/5 of the amount of trees as we had before. As you can see in this photo, these posts are the property line, and on the right of that is what this forest used to look like. And now on the left is what it looks like today. All of this work was done with wildfire prevention in mind. That was kind of the main driver for this thinning work. And it was done mechanically, so with the use of a masticator. This photo is an example of a masticator on an excavator. It's basically a big rotating machine with giant teeth that takes trees and turns them into not trees. During this time, they created hundreds of wildlife trees or snags, as well as dozens of habitat piles. I'll go into a little more detail on those later, but I'm going to talk about Adam and I. So Adam and I came aboard Matt Creek Ranch in the spring of 2021, and we were pretty new to the world of forestry, so as we were learning as much as we could about it and the history of the land, we needed to put some numbers to what we were seeing out in the forest. So in order to do this, we conducted an extensive forest inventory. When we did this, we implemented over 170 quarter-acre forest plots, and these are permanent plots that allow us to do long-term monitoring. So we can go back to these plots and measure trees 15 years later, measure the same trees, and see how they respond to our management practices. When we were doing these plots, we looked at the species composition of what was there, the density of the trees, the size. We cored trees in every plot to look at the age, the growth rate. We monitored diseases, dwarf mistletoe, and we looked at habitat features that were available, even counted how many logs were laying on the ground. So we did our best to collect as much data as we could. And we also implemented a handful of prairie vegetation plots, square meter plots that allow us to quantify the species richness and the diversity in the prairies. And these are tied to our forest plots, so they are also long-term monitoring plots. The whole time we were walking around in the woods, we were identifying and recording every plant species we saw. So we have a running list of over 200 native plants, including 7 species of orchids and a handful of rare and endemic plants, some of which haven't been seen in the area in close to 100 years. And here's one of our orchids that we found up there. So after we crunched the numbers and we learned more about the history of the land, we realized we had more work to do. One of the big things we realized is that a lot of this forest historically was never a forest. This is an area that we were working in, and it was part of the Swamp Prairie. Since fire exclusion, conifer trees have began encroaching on the prairie and shading it out, bringing in snowberry, and eventually would convert this system into a forest. We love trees, but we couldn't sit by and watch this beautiful prairie disappear. So we went through and thinned a lot of the smaller trees, removed some shrubs. We retained the large trees that were there, but we wanted to protect what prairie was still there. We also reduced ladder fuels wherever the masticator didn't do so. Ladder fuels are a type of fuel that can carry fire from the ground up into the crowns of trees, which causes more severe fires in forests. So these can be low-hanging branches, small trees and shrubs that are underneath large trees. We disposed of our slash, and we also disposed of a lot of bratwursts during this time. And then we did a deep dive on habitat creation. So I'll take the next few slides to go over some of the habitat projects we've done, beginning with wildlife trees. If Ken Bevis was here, he'd break out into song right now. Wildlife trees are standing dead trees that were intentionally killed or left for wildlife habitat. They are a very important component to the forest for many reasons. The first and foremost is wildlife habitat. There are over 100 species in Washington that depend on wildlife trees for nesting, foraging, and shelter. And that's just vertebrate species. That's just birds, mammals, amphibians, and reptiles. That doesn't include insects, arachnids, fungi, plants, lichen. That number would be way higher if somebody were actually to quantify all of that. And it's very important for us to do as much as we can for wildlife, because right now we're living in a time of the 6th mass extinction. There's a worldwide biodiversity crisis happening, and I feel as land stewards, it's our responsibility to do everything we can to help wildlife. Another amazing thing about snags is that they fall over and rot. And that decaying wood is fundamental to forest soil. I'll get into that a little bit more in the next slide, but I want to talk about how you create wildlife trees. So there are a handful of ways to kill a tree. We began by girdling them. So we take a chainsaw and remove a band of bark and cambium around the base. And eventually this kills the tree, and it leaves the entire tree standing, dead for wildlife. Recently, we've moved to topping trees, taking advantage of our resident spider monkey, John, climbing these trees, removing limbs, and taking the tops out of them. He then roughs up the tops to make it look more natural and help the decay process happen quicker. In my opinion, these are the best wildlife trees because we can control the height of them. And so if they're anywhere near a road, we can make sure if they fall toward the road that they won't fall over the road. And because they don't have tops in them, they're much less susceptible to breaking or falling over in the wind. And then habitat piles. Habitat piles have become my favorite thing to work on and study in the forest. These are intentionally created structures that you make for wildlife habitat. Typically, they're built with a base of logs. They're not slash piles. You can also use stumps or rocks and boulders. We use logs because that's what we have available to us. In the top photo here, this is kind of the old school style of making a habitat pile. You would stack the logs this way and then top it with a bunch of slash, and that provides more shading and thermal cover for the critters that are using it. We have been creating these piles here on the bottom picture, and I like these piles because they look a little bit more complex. They have varying sizes of cavities within them for different sizes of critters, and I think they look nice. So one of the beauties of habitat piles is that it allows you to retain high quality wildlife habitat while doing fuels reduction work in your forest. I've driven by a lot of fire-wise jobs that tend to clean the forest up a little too much, and they don't leave a lot for wildlife. The great thing about these piles is that you build them and you can put them wherever you want. So we usually set these piles away from trees or in little clearings, so if they ever were to ignite, they don't torch the trees around them. And you can see here that there's a yellow-bellied marmot climbing over this pile, and this was only about 2 weeks after we built it. And then soil. This is one of the most important things that habitat piles and all decaying wood in a forest does that we never see. So when soil rots and breaks down, it feeds all the little microorganisms and bugs in the soil, and it is the fundamental source of organic matter in forest soils. Decaying wood is also the foundation of the animal food chain in a forest. All the detritivores and bugs and beetles that eat decaying wood are what a lot of other animals eat, and they feed other predators. So even things like red-tailed hawks need decaying wood in forest ecosystems. And research. We have been monitoring some of our piles for the last couple of years using game cameras. We've recently added these bucket camera traps that you can see that allow us to detect little critters running in and out of the piles. We've documented a couple dozen species using these piles, and now we're working with a university student to hopefully publish some research about this. We're also testing different ways of creating piles, construction methods, density, size, and this will allow us to better inform land managers of how to create the best wildlife habitat on their land. Oh. No, I lost a slide, but water features are another thing that's really important to wildlife. It's crucial to wildlife, especially as climate change and drought intensifies. Animals need water to survive just like we do. Matt Creek Ranch is lucky to have a handful of streams and ponds on the property that we are working to enhance for wildlife. I have a little clip of a stock pond out in the forest. This was dug a long time ago for cattle, and it fills up with groundwater in the spring and it dries up in the fall. And I've had a camera rolling on it for 1.5 years, and I've seen dozens of species using this water source. One of my favorite things about these little ponds is that amphibians breed in them. So at the time of this clip, there were hundreds, if not thousands, of tadpoles swimming around in these little ponds out there. So just keep that in mind while you watch this clip. It's It's a little bit glitchy. But. We tried. One of our most recent and my proudest land management activity that we have been able to complete is that we returned fire to the landscape last year. So last year we were able to burn 220 acres of forest and grassland, and I feel very lucky to be a part of that. One of our major goals is to restore the fire regime. Fire regime is the natural pattern of the frequency and intensity of fire moving through the landscape. So in much of the inland northwest dry forest, it was typically fire would return every 5 to 20 years, and it would usually be a low intensity fire, sometimes mixed severity fire. In the SWAC area that we work in, it was generally more frequent than that. My guess is around every 5 years, 5 to 7 years. And that means that this forest has missed probably around 20 fires in the last 120 years. So we have a lot of ground to make up for. This is a fire-dependent ecosystem. So as I said before, these forests evolved with humans and human management and fire. And even before humans were burning it, lightning strikes would happen and they would burn through the landscape. Ponderosa pine are a shade-intolerant species, so they need it to be open. They need a lot of sunlight. And there are a lot of benefits to prescribed fire. First and foremost, fuels reduction. If you have an open forest landscape like this and you burn the fuels off every 5 to 10 years, if a wildfire were to come through, there's no way for it to become an intense stand-destroying fire because there's not much to burn. Another benefit is that it thins out the smaller trees and it limbs the larger trees. We call that thermal thinning, and it reduces competition for the trees that are there. So they have less competition for sunlight as well as water, which are the two most limiting resources for all plants on Earth. Another benefit of fire is that when things char and sit in the soil, carbon is captured and held in that soil for thousands of years, and it fertilizes the plants. We've experienced the wildfires coming back stronger than ever after our burn, and we expect that trend to continue as we reestablish the fire regime. There are also human health benefits from prescribed fire. The smoke emitted from prescribed fire is way less detrimental to human health than it is from wildfire. In wildfires, you don't know what's burning. It could be plastic siding on houses and tires and cars. And it is a lot cleaner from a prescribed burn. So if we have more prescribed fire smoke, hopefully in the future we'll have less wildfire smoke. We also have a lot of control over these burns, so we only burn on days where we know the smoke will be lifted out and it won't affect anybody. The other human health benefit from this is that it's a great way to reduce tick populations. And ticks carry a lot of really nasty diseases like Lyme disease and Rocky Mountain spotted fever. And this was an area that had a lot of ticks in it that we knew carried those diseases. So it was great to be able to bring down that tick population. And if you are local to the Leavenworth area, Cascadia Prescribed Burn Association is a great organization to learn more about what prescribed fire. We have one representative here from there today, and they help landowners learn more about prescribed fire. They host trainings, and they're a great organization that we always call when we're burning. So now I'm going to bring up Adam Hess to talk about some of the other management activities that we've been doing.
Thanks, Tyler.
Good job, Adam. You can do it.
Well, thank you, everyone, and thanks to the Wenatchee River Institute for having us here today. So my name is Adam Hess. I also went to Central Washington University with Tyler, met him through the biology department, and we bonded and became friends over our love of reptiles and amphibians and beer. So I'm going to talk about some of the restoration projects that we've been working on. So we're in, Mack Creek Ranch is in a unique position because we're managing around 400 acres of prairie and grassland in the historic Squaw Prairie. And the reason why that is unique is because prairies and grasslands are some of the most endangered ecosystems in America. Washington State, for example, only has about 3% of its prairie left. This is mostly due to agriculture and development. About 70% of our agricultural crops used to be on grassland. It's also due to overgrazing and invasive species. So prairies and grasslands have been really fragmented over time and have been heavily degraded. So some of the issues and threats that we're dealing with specifically at Matt Creek Ranch: fire exclusion, like Tyler was talking about. The Native Americans were burning prairies for thousands of years, and the SWAC is no different. They were burning those lands for camas bulbs and to improve camas fields and lomatium and fritillaria and other species that they were using as crops. We're also dealing with a lot of noxious weeds, especially some of the invasive annual grasses that we have that are really widespread around here. So bulbous bluegrass, cheatgrass, ventonata grass, these are all species that are really widespread and very damaging. So what are we doing about it? As Tyler mentioned, we've done some prescribed fire. Last year we burned over 100 acres of grassland and prairie up at work. We're really hoping that this will help cut back on the amount of pine encroachment that we're dealing with, as well as help out camas, fritillaria, and those other crops that used to be considerably more common. And it'll also help with pine encroachment. So we're going to be monitoring how the plant community changes over the next few years after we've introduced fire. We've also done annual grazing on about 200 acres over the last 3 years. And we've been working on experimenting with heavy cultivation and mechanical treatment of a lot of our fields, especially fields that we're pulling out of hay production, because they have been, we've been growing Timothy hay on them for decades and kind of have to start over from the beginning with those, go back to stage 0, because there's just so many weed seeds and the native seeds wouldn't be able to compete with those. I should say that we are not using any herbicide for this. We're trying to do it without chemical application, which has been challenging. It's something where we have to take weeds into consideration for any other method of restoration. If we want to burn a field and there's some cheatgrass there, it's going to make cheatgrass worse. If we want to use grazing on a field but there's ventonata, if it gets overgrazed, then there's going to be more ventonata. So it's just been a bit of a learning curve with stuff like that. Then I want to talk about creek restoration. So many of the streams throughout the West over the last 200 years have become heavily degraded and simplified. They've become incised and straightened. Some of this was due to, just land management. Farmers wanting to drain a field, and so they straighten a creek and make it more efficient. But a lot of it's also due to, we almost lost beavers. We're missing two key components to healthy stream systems: beavers and large woody debris. So beavers, there was probably about 200 million of them in the 1800s is what people estimate, and then they were almost wiped out. They were almost extirpated due to the fur trade. Now there's around 15 million of them in North America again. Why do beavers matter? Well, beavers are a keystone species, and they are an ecosystem engineer. So they're building beaver dams, they're felling trees, large woody debris into the system. They're making it considerably more complex, holding in water. You're getting a lot more pooling, you're getting side channels, and it's just a more complex, resilient system. So what are we doing? This summer, we're going to be working on a project that we're very excited about. where we're going to be trying out low-tech process-based restoration, LTPBR, which is making beaver dam analogs and post-assisted log structures. So instead of going in with a bunch of excavators and bulldozers and trying to take the system back to stage 0 and possibly compacting the soil or anything like that, with beaver dam analogs and low-tech PBR, it's just a group of people going in, pretending to be beavers for a week. We're going to take in a whole bunch of woody debris, some of which our spider monkey John brought us. We're going to be bringing in a lot of woody debris, using sediment from within the stream, using posts to hold it all in place. And the reason for that is then we can hold back water, we'll get more water infiltration, we can expand the riparian zone, and we can make a more complex system. We're also going to be planting 5,300 native plants along the creek to try to expand the riparian zone because there isn't much of one along Mack Creek right now. And by doing that, we'll be improving habitat, we'll be shading the stream eventually, which is good for salmonids, cooling the water, and hopefully we'll be providing a food source for beavers in the future if they come in on their own or if we get a chance to reintroduce them ourselves. So you do need permits for this. When we first started looking into this like a year and a half ago and actually talking with a consultant from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife Service, they kind of put us on the track for what all we were going to need. The first thing we had to do was get a cultural survey done and then wait to get the cultural report back. Then we could use that to apply for an HPA, a hydraulic project approval, through Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. And thankfully, they have a streamlined version of that called Fish Habitat Enhancement Project. So essentially with that, you show that your project will most likely help fish or could possibly help fish and habitat. And then you need to get sponsored by an organization like DNR, WDFW, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, or DOT, or a federally recognized Native American tribe. And we were lucky enough to get sponsorship from Yakima Nation. So we've been working closely with one of their biologists. We got approval. We get to do the Fish Habitat Enhancement Project, which let us bypass a number of other permits that now I don't have to fill out. And I just want to emphasize that this isn't something that only like large conservation organizations can do. Like landowners can do this. It seems a little bit intimidating once you're looking into all the permitting process and everybody you have to talk to. But it really didn't take that long. I mean, we're looking at just over a year to get everything figured out. And now we get to do it this summer. So if anybody is interested in doing anything like this, feel free to reach out or talk to me after the presentation. Thank you.
Yeah, that was really good. So to wrap it up, I'll drive home the point again. Active management is necessary to be good land stewards and to create healthy and resilient ecosystems. Private landowners have the ability to make large landscape level impacts when we work together, experiment, share our knowledge, and support each other. The product of this work is very rewarding, and we're creating a safer, more beautiful, and more biodiverse place for all of us to live and work and recreate in. The best way to get started, in my opinion, with becoming a good steward of your land is to create a stewardship plan. This allows you to become familiar with your land in a way that you haven't been before, and yourself. You have to look inside of yourself and see and identify the things that you really care about and why your land matters to you. This will drive your management goals and help you figure out your objectives to get you there in the future. I've included a few resources. This is kind of geared toward forest landowners, but you can benefit from these resources too if you're not a forest landowner. WSU Extension Forestry has a vast library of resources, and they can help you connect with professionals. They also host a stewardship planning course for landowners, which Adam and I have both attended, and we learned so much from it. The DNR has a small forestry landowner office, and they have service foresters that can come out and do site visits. And the DNR, as well as the NRCS, both offer cost share programs to help landowners. They help landowners foot the bill on some of these management activities. So they can really save you a lot of money. And if you do these management practices yourself, you can actually be reimbursed for them. I've included my email on there too, so if you have any questions or want to talk about this some more, you can reach out to me. And I really appreciate Wenatchee River Institute for hosting us here so we can share our story with everybody. Thank you all for being here, and thank you for everyone joining us online. And I really hope that we can inspire future land stewards, because if we all work together, we can create healthy ecosystems and we can really make a huge difference together. So thank you all. Cool. So if anyone has questions, I'm going to have Martha and Adam join me again, so I can deflect.
Yeah, I have a question, Adam. Could you talk about the intensity of the BDAs? I mean, you had a picture of one BDA up there, but talk about just what you're planning on that creek.
Yeah, so well, we're going to be putting in posts across the channel. Probably be like 8 posts across. It's, you know, channel's about that wide. We're going to be putting in about 8 posts. Oh, right. And then weaving material through there. It'll end up being pretty thick. We're going to be packing in sediment, cut grass, a lot of branches, throwing in logs. So they will look like actual beaver dams.
And then how many of them in what linear distance?
35 to 40 across the entire creek, which I think is, I don't remember how long it is. It's about a half a mile, yeah.
I mean, that's a lot.
Yeah. We've been told that's probably about right where we want to be, though.
Yeah. And those structures aren't permanent. They're not meant to be permanent. Mm-hmm. We're expecting some failure, and so building in some redundancy into that system will make sure that they don't all blow out in the first spring.
Yeah, it's better to use more smaller dams than it is to just rely on a few big ones.
Would you leave them in place if you did reintroduce actual beavers?
Yeah, they'll just add to them.
Just interact with them?
Yeah.
Okay.
And the permit's for 5 years, so we'll also probably be doing maintenance on all the dams in that time.
I was going to ask about habitat pile maintenance. Like, do you foresee like the need to do any sort of like upkeep on those, or?
Yeah. So a lot of the pictures that I showed of habitat piles, they had nice green slash on top. Mm-hmm. In a couple of years, all of those needles will drop, and it won't look as covered. And the quality of cover that the slash provides will degrade over time. It'll be the first thing that starts to decay. So it's a good idea to add slash to that every few years. And you can maintain piles. Personally, I will probably let a lot of those piles decay, and we can build new piles. I think having a variety of states of decay of piles is useful because it provides more variation for wildlife.
Do you anticipate any species potentially being subsidized by those piles?
Yep.
What species, and how do you think it could potentially impact like the vertebrate wildlife community? Like, could it throw something out of balance, or?
I think that it provides additional cover definitely for rodents. They are the most frequent occupants of these piles. Primarily talking about chipmunks, the handful of squirrel species that we have, shrews, and mice. I don't think what we're doing has enough of an effect to completely throw out the balance of the food chain. I'm hoping that it does increase the population, and that will benefit the predators that feed on those. But I mean, we're surrounded by roads all over the place. There are areas all around us that are being developed. So wildlife is being displaced and directly killed in those areas. So if we have a slightly higher population of animals in our forest than maybe there used to be, I'm happy with that.
Yeah. Thank you.
Are you guys looking at density of those piles, like per acre?
We are planning on that. So we only have so many cameras that we're monitoring them with, and we're running one. We're still kind of figuring our settings out and our methods. And we have a couple things lined up, and we're getting some baseline data too, checking areas that have no piles and never have to see what wildlife is rolling through there compared to the piles. And eventually, that is one of the things I want to test. A lot of biologists that are in the forestry world, they have their recommendations for piles per acre. It's usually 1 to 2. So I'd like to see how that affects it. I have a feeling that the proximity of the piles to adjacent cover is going to make them more effective habitat. Yeah.
Just had a note from someone online saying that Cascadia Conservation District is a great local organization to connect landowners for some of these practices you're talking about, for landowners in this area.
Yeah, and if I'm not mistaken, Cascadia Prescribed Burn Association is a product of the Cascadia Conservation District. And so, yeah, it's a great resource for folks up in Chelan County up here and even further out than that. They have a lot of knowledge within that organization.
So I was just wondering, besides reducing fuel for future fires, how do you see the management you're doing as making that land more climate resilient?
Yeah, so by opening up this forest, historically, Ponderosa pine forest was really open. The trees were much larger than a lot of what we see today, but the stocking levels were around 20 trees an acre. So currently, our forest is around 40 to 60 trees an acre, but they are smaller. And so we're hoping to grow those trees over time. We can create more habitat and get back to close to that historical stocking level. Those trees store a lot of carbon, and prescribed fire promotes that carbon storage as well. Go ahead, Mike.
I was going to say another element is that with those openings, there's research proving that snowpack lasts longer in those openings, and so actually there's more retention of moisture on the ground and in the ground. Don't have the sublimation, snow doesn't get down and pack up, so these openings are, and we're paying some attention to that as well.
Yeah. Do you have anything to add to that?
Actually, yeah, and grasslands also sequester a lot of carbon, and so as we're shifting these fields to like larger bunch grasses that are native, that have really deep root systems, will be helping sequester carbon. And when wildfire comes through, you're only losing a small amount of that carbon from the top, from the actual plant, as opposed to all the carbon that's stored in the root systems and the soil down below, unlike with trees, if there's a crown fire.
Yeah.
And from a landowner perspective, this has been an evolutionary process for us just as a work product. We started with a fear of wildfire, and you saw that one of those early pictures of what had been, we had done the forest work, and then an adjoining property is very dense. Ours looked just like that. It was 250 trees per acre probably, and we had many truckloads of logs go out a number of years ago. But in the course of doing that work and then bringing in the science and the persistence of paying attention, we then moved to think about fire and prairie restoration, and now the creek. So there has been this evolution that's taken place over the many years we've been stewarding this landscape, but with the focus of changing our practices, learning from them, trying new things. We really do call it experimental. And as Adam was talking about the non-herbicide side of prairie restoration, it's a tough thing to work with when everyone else uses an herbicide. But we're able to be side by side with a neighbor who's doing that and make comparisons. We may find we may have to use more herbicides, but the experimentation and with the data collection has been really exciting. Those have all been stepwise in the process of doing this work. As a landowner, we're thinking about it that way, that it doesn't have to all happen at once.
Yeah, and one more thing to add to that is I've noticed in our forests and the surrounding forests, I'm noticing more and more pine beetle kill. I think I forgot to say it while I was talking about it, but prescribed fire promotes more sap production in trees in ponderosa. And there have been studies done where they looked at ponderosa that experiences frequent low-intensity fire and ponderosa that hasn't. And the trees that experience that disturbance, they have much more pitch reserves, and they're much better able to defend themselves against beetles. So we might be creating a short-term disturbance that we might lose some trees from, but in the long term, these trees are going to be healthier for it, and we'll have less likelihood of losing them to beetles.
I'm just curious about the prairie restoration, especially these areas that have been farmed and overgrazed, and just kind of anything you're finding that may work better than others.
Any resources, like what's the logistics of like planting seed? How do you do it? What are the resources that we can tap into to figure out how best to get that to go? Because, you know, we've sprinkled seed. It doesn't go.
And in an area that has been originally farmed and then grazed, cattle grazed, and most often overgrazed. And it just seems like as that continues to graze, we're seeing less and less wildlife in the area and more cattle, and it just tends to kind of wipe the area out. Just maybe early on, kind of some of the things you might be seeing as improvements.
Yeah, well, so the main thing with that stuff is you pretty much have to take the field back to stage 0 a lot of times and make it bare soil, because if you're just putting native seed into where there's already a bunch of non-natives and invasives, they're not going to be able to outcompete what's already established there. So if you take it back to bare soil and try to get a lot of those non-natives out of there, then the seed has a much better chance of being able to establish itself. It's also a matter of, you know, choosing the right species for your area. You know, if you look around and figure out what's native in your area, then you can get a mix formulated for that. BFI native seeds out of Moses Lake is a great resource. There's also Clearwater seeds out of Spokane. But yeah, it's about like prepping the seed bed and then using the right mix. So with the hay fields that we've pulled out, we found that we're pretty much going to have to go back to stage 0 and bare soil, and it takes time, because if you disturb that site, right, and then any non-native seeds that are there, they're going to germinate and come up, and you've got kind of the same problem. So yeah, it's a process.
Another question from online. When do you plan to return fire again to the property?
Well, we have a lot of areas that we have not burned yet. We are getting burn plan written, and we're hoping to burn this fall in an area that we haven't burned yet. I think it'll be a few years before we return it to an area that we have already burned. I think a 5 to 10 year return interval right now would be sufficient, and we can see how that goes. So we're pretty much planning on burning every year if we can until we get everything that we want to burn burned. And then we'll be on track to bring fire back and reestablish that fire regime when the time's right.
I feel like I might know the answer to this question, but when you are burning areas like in the prairie, for instance, and you have bare ground, are you going to take that opportunity to supplement with native seeds to outcompete any of the potential invaders?
Yes, we did that after the fall burn in October. I went and had somebody broadcast like 300 pounds of blue wild rye and mountain brome seeds. And then this early spring went out, the ground was still black, there was some bulbous bluegrass and other non-natives coming up, but I could see those seeds on the surface and they'd have blades of grass coming up through them. So, and now it's completely greened up.
Are there outfits to help with, for private property owners to help with these prescribed burns? Are they the resources that you had up here? Not to the extent you're talking about, but when you're dealing with grasses mainly, and like I said, they've been grazed and farmed years and years ago, there's still a lot of native grass there, but it's being choked out by a lot of non-native. And so how do you go about burning on private property if it's 20, 40 acres for the smaller landowner? Are there resources out there to help with those owners?
There are. The model of prescribed burn associations, which in Washington it's relatively new. This was kind of an idea that has worked for a long time in the Midwest, where farmers would just go over to each other's land and light off fields together. And that's kind of where that comes from. Unfortunately, a lot of restrictions and liability concerns have made burning a little tighter, especially in the West. So we use a local fuels crew, and then we have a fuels crew down in the Columbia River Gorge, and they have recently started a prescribed burn association. We bring in guys from Cascadia Prescribed Burn Association, and then we have us, and whatever we can't cover with that, we have to hire a crew. So hopefully in the future, it'll be easier to accomplish prescribed fire. But right now, you will be mainly hiring it out unless you are in an area with a prescribed burn association and you're able to work with them and other landowners who are interested. Then it becomes more feasible to get these done on the cheaper side. But when you factor in control lines, hose lays, containment, and usually you have to have people monitoring afterward for weeks, a lot of mop up. It gets expensive, but the DNR they cost shared our prescribed burn, and so that does take care of a lot of that.
And the alternative of wildfire is then you lose it all.
Yeah.
Maybe talk about our experience with the cross-boundary burn. We worked with our neighbors and did the prairie burning across multiple.
Go ahead, let's go. Sure.
Yeah, well, we got to do a cross-boundary burn last spring with a neighbor, which was really cool. A lot of the people that were, like all the firefighters, were pretty excited about it. Yeah, it's great that multiple landowners can come together and burn at the same time, get it all done in one day. It was, Lisa's side was another 120 acres. Yeah, so it was a pretty big burn.
So what it reduces is all the fire breaks and the hose lays and having crews to do it. If two different owners do it, a week apart because the window's so tight, we were able to get a much bigger piece of this was grassland, this was prairie, and a little bit of forest.
Yeah.
It really becomes more collaborative. And like you said, I think the community was excited to think about the neighbors working together. So it was a good model for that.
Yeah, it's not common. And also the more acreage you burn at a time, the less it costs per acre to burn it. So
Yeah.
that was a great thing to come together.
So burning 20 acres can get expensive enough that it may not be worth it, but if you can go in with your neighbors, if they have the same mindset, and you can pull out a little bit of fences and burn across and share some of that cost, your cost per acre goes way down, and it makes it more cost effective to do that.
ask questions? All right. Well, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Matt Creek Farm.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah. Have a good night, and thank you everyone for joining us.
Thank you.
All right, team.